And we're back. We're talking about eating disorders, and we're going to continue that with just briefly talking about the causes proposed. Not everybody who goes on a starvation diet or a very, very restricted diet, even not everybody who binges and purges occasionally will develop a psychological disorder. It's all of the symptoms, or the majority of the symptoms, need to be there before they're diagnosed. So there seems to be, first, a genetic predisposition. A person's predisposed to engage in that type of behavior. I think it correlates well with the used to believe that alcoholism was passed on genetically. If your father was an alcoholic, you have the potential to be an alcoholic, and so you should never drink. So you don't engage that predisposition. More likely, researchers are saying that there's an addictive personality disorder, that there are those who are more prone to become addicted to whatever it is that they do for coping. So if you have the addictive gene, if you will, that's oversimplifying, then gambling might become your addiction, or porn might become your addiction, although pornography is much more common addiction, even in those probably who don't have the addictive gene. Alcoholism, smoking, and eating, problems surrounding eating become addictive as well. So binging and purging occasionally, crash dieting for those who have the predisposition, that's playing with fire. Societal pressures, of course. We know that anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder are much more common in first world countries. Why? Because there's more food. Food is not a luxury. It's just available everywhere, and we tend to have the message placed on us from a very young age that to be successful, to be healthy, to be attractive is to be thin. And some of us are not genetically prepared or programmed to be thin. Some of us are not genetically programmed to have an hourglass figure or rock hard abs. So the societal pressure, particularly on young women, to be intelligent, to look right, to act right, can be overwhelming. And some young girls will turn to dangerous dieting in order to achieve what is almost unattainable genetically for them. And very often people with eating disorders have a distorted identity in the first place, that they learned at a young age that what's inside of them isn't what counts, that what they do and how they look is what counts. Particularly in cases of childhood abuse, the restrictive eating takes on a self-punitive tone. I don't deserve to eat this food. I'm a bad person. So they feel almost as if they're punishing themselves. And by punishing themselves, they're coping with whatever stress that they feel that they've brought on their life. And finally, talk with any person who treats a person with eating disorder, the very first thing they'll say is it's not about the food. It's also not necessarily about the weight. A person with anorexia nervosa may not even monitor their weight, but they will look in the mirror and ensure that their efforts are having the desired effect. Now, part of anorexia nervosa is when those people look in the mirror, what they see is not skin and bones, and the fact that they almost have no body fat, that they see a little pooch here that's out of place. They see a little curve here that they don't want anymore. And you can look at them and say, my goodness, you've lost so much weight. You look wonderful. You might even look a little bit too skinny. And they don't see it. Their perception of their body does not match or correspond with the feedback from their eyes. They always see themselves as heavier and less attractive than they look. And then, of course, when a person gets down to that level, now they look sickly, not attractive. They look skeletal, not healthy, and can cause many problems. Of course, I'm sorry for my clearing my throat here. All right, move on to cognitive development. I like this slide, or I like this concept. There's a lot of information, so if you follow along, I'll try to make it more simple. The brain of an adolescent is not the same as the brain of a child. Of course, it's the same brain in the same person, but the functioning really changes dramatically over adolescence. The brain has to prepare to move from childlike thinking, to adult-like thinking, and it's got quite a ways to go, beginning in puberty. So scientists have paid a lot of attention to brain development, especially in an area called the prefrontal cortex. Sounds fancy and hard, but it's not. The prefrontal cortex is the tippy front of the brain. It's this area here. So before the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe's in yellow. That's what allows you to think and reason and solve problems. It's the executive center of your brain. The tippy front is the area that controls, or the area that's been identified as the sober second thought area. So you have an idea, you have an inkling, and you think, hey, it might be a good idea to drive my car 120 miles down the freeway. There's probably no police officers. Your prefrontal cortex kicks in and says, probably not a good idea. We should inhibit that idea. It's also the area that's first shut down in those who've been drinking. Even after one or two drinks, the prefrontal cortex is sluggish and not offering sober second thoughts. That's why people who drink behave in ways that are impulsive, not necessarily consistent with their personality. So this area is involved in reasoning, decision-making, and, like I've said, impulse control. It's the area in children with attention deficit disorder that's not functioning as well as it will be later on. So people with ADD have poor impulse control. Another area that's developing rapidly in adolescence is the limbic system. The limbic system is the area involved in emotional reasoning. It's also the area involved that has pleasure centers. Pleasure centers are simply areas in your brain that tell you that it feels good. So you eat a good meal, your pleasure centers say, that feels good. I feel relaxed and comfortable. If somebody kisses you on the cheek that you really like, your pleasure centers say that felt really good, and you have an overall sense of well-being. The limbic system matures before the prefrontal cortex. So while adolescents are receiving immediate feedback from their behavior that things feel good, their prefrontal cortex isn't quite as quick in saying, yeah, but that's dangerous, or yeah, but we probably shouldn't do that again. So in very impulsive decisions, searching out things that make them feel good, and in adolescence, it's a time of exploration, it's a time of learning for myself, whether or not my parents were right, and seeking of new experiences. So I seek out a new experience, it feels really good, the limbic system tells me, and I seek to do it again, often without considering the short or long-term consequences. Now, when the prefrontal cortex comes online, when it really begins to kick in, we see some of the characteristics of adulthood. There's a decrease in risk-taking and thrill-seeking for some adults, not all, but for many adults. The PFC is constantly telling them to think carefully, what this is going to mean for your future, what are the consequences of this, you probably shouldn't engage in that kind of behavior. And because it's able to exert a more forceful stimulus, the adult perhaps is capable of making more mature, better decisions, and certainly be much less impulsive. So we can say that teens are making limbic system decisions. Experience is providing that pleasure within their limbic system. Okay. Moving on to formal operations. Remember we talked about sensory motor stage. This is Piaget. The sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, and I demonstrated what an operation was. The concrete operational stage was in a previous chapter where children can understand concrete reality. If I can touch it and see it, I can understand it. But they don't understand abstraction very well. They don't understand love in the sense of anything outside of the loving actions that a person may take. Ask a child, how do you know your mother loves you? The child will say, she buys stuff for me. She tells me so. Ask an adolescent, how do you know your parent loves you? And they'll start talking about an abstract idea. I'm her child. People love their children. I'm her progeny. I'm her future. Those are the ideas there. That's formal operational thought. So as a teen begins to engage in more formal operational thought, they demonstrate the ability to use abstract thinking and reason hypothetically. They can come up with hypotheticals such as the abstract idea. I'm going to pause here for a moment. I'll be back.